In many ways, the functionaries were like children. Often they could be so deeply offended by the merest trifle. Unfortunately, Kay's behavior could not be classed as a trifle, that they would stop speaking even to old friends, give them the cold shoulder, and work against them in all imaginable ways. But then suddenly, in the most surprising fashion and without any particular reason, they would be moved to laughter by some small jest, which you only dared to make because you felt you had nothing to lose, and then they were your friends again. In fact, it was both easy and difficult to handle them. You could hardly lay down any fixed principles for dealing with them. Sometimes you felt astonished to think that one single ordinary lifetime sufficed to gather all the knowledge needed for a fair degree of success in such a profession. There were dark hours, of course, such as came to everybody, in which you thought you had achieved nothing at all, in which it seemed to you that only the cases predestined from the start to succeed came to a good end, which they would have reached in any event without your help, while every one of the others was doomed to fail in spite of all your maneuvers, all your exertions, all the illusory little victories on which you plumed yourself. That was a frame of mind, of course, in which nothing at all seemed certain, and so you could not positively deny, when questioned, that your intervention might have sidetracked some cases which would have run quite well on the right lines had they been left alone. A desperate kind of self-assurance, to be sure, yet it was the only kind available at such times. These moods, for of course they were only moods, nothing more, afflicted lawyers more especially when a case which they had conducted satisfactorily to the desired point was suddenly taken out of their hands. That was beyond all doubt the worst thing that could happen to a lawyer. Not that a client ever dismissed his lawyer from a case, such a thing was not done. An accused man, once having briefed a lawyer, must stick to him whatever happened. For how could he keep going by himself once he had called in someone to help him? So that never happened, but it did sometimes happen that the case took a turn where the lawyer could no longer follow it. The case and the accused and everything were simply withdrawn from the lawyer. Then, even the best connections with officials could no longer achieve any result, for even they knew nothing. The case had simply reached the stage where further assistance was ruled out. It was being conducted in a remote, inaccessible court. Then you might come home someday and find on your table all the countless pleas relating to the case which you had drawn up with such pains and such high hopes. They had been returned to you because in the new stage of the trial they were not admitted as relevant. They were mere waste paper. It did not follow that the case was lost, by no means. At least there was no decisive evidence for such an assumption. You simply knew nothing more about the case and would never know anything more about it. Now, very luckily, such occurrences were exceptional, and even if Kay's case were a case of that nature, it still had a long way to go before reaching that stage. For the time being, there were abundant opportunities for legal labor, and Kay might rest assured that they would be exploited to the utmost. The first plea, as before mentioned, was not yet handed in, but there was no hurry. Far more important were the preliminary consultations with the relevant officials, and they had already taken place. With varying success, as must be frankly admitted. It would be better for the time being not to divulge details which might have a bad influence on Kay by elating or depressing him unduly. Yet this much could be asserted, that certain officials had expressed themselves very graciously and had also shown great readiness to help, while others had expressed themselves less favorably. But in spite of that, had by no means refused their collaboration. The result on the whole was therefore very gratifying, though one must not seek to draw any definite conclusion from that. Since all preliminary negotiations began in the same way and only in the course of further developments did it appear whether they had real value or not. At any rate, nothing was yet lost, and if they could manage to win over the chief clerk of the court in spite of all that had happened, various moves had already been initiated toward that end. Then, to use a surgeon's expression, this could be regarded as a clean wound, and one could await further developments with an easy mind. In such and similar harangues, Kay's lawyer was inexhaustible. He reiterated them every time Kay called on him. Progress had always been made, but the nature of the progress could never be divulged. The lawyer was always working away at the first plea, but it had never reached a conclusion, which at the next visit turned out to be an advantage. Since the last few days would have been very inauspicious for handling it, Since the last few days would have been very inauspicious for handing it in, a fact which no one could have foreseen. If Kay, as sometimes happened, wearied out by the lawyer's volubility, remarked that even taking into account all the difficulties, the case seemed to be getting on very slowly, he was met with the retort that it was not getting on slowly at all, although they would have been much further on by now had Kay come to the lawyer in time. Unfortunately, he had neglected to do so, and that omission was likely to keep him at a disadvantage, and not merely a temporal disadvantage either. The one welcome interruption to these visits was Lenny, who always so arranged things that she brought in the lawyer's tea while Kay was present. She would stand behind Kay's chair, apparently looking on, while the lawyer stooped with a kind of miserly greed over his cup and poured out and sipped his tea, but all the time she was letting Kay surreptitiously hold her hand. There was total silence. The lawyer sipped. Kay squeezed Lenny's hand, and sometimes Lenny ventured to caress his hair. "Are you still here?" the lawyer would ask after he had finished. "I wanted to take the tea tray away," Lenny would answer. There would follow a last hand clasp. The lawyer would wipe his mouth and begin again with new energy to harangue Kay. Was the lawyer seeking to comfort him or to drive him to despair? Kay could not tell, but he soon held it for an established fact that his defense was not in good hands. It might be all true, of course, what the lawyer said, though his attempts to magnify his own importance were transparent enough, and it was likely that he had never till now conducted such an important case as he imagined Kay's to be. But his continual bragging of his personal connections with the officials was suspicious. Was it so certain that he was exploiting these connections entirely for Kay's benefit? The lawyer never forgot to mention that these officials were subordinate officials, therefore officials in a very dependent position, for whose advancement certain turns in the various cases might in all probability be of some importance. Could they possibly employ the lawyer to bring about such turns in the case, turns which were bound, of course, to be unfavorable to the accused? Perhaps they did not always do that. It was hardly likely. There must be occasions on which they arranged that the lawyer should score a point or two as a reward for his services, since it was to their own interest for him to keep up his professional reputation. But if that were really the position, into which category were they likely to put Kay's case, which, as the lawyer maintained, was a very difficult, therefore important case, and had roused great interest in the court from the very beginning? There could not be very much doubt what they would do. A clue was already provided by the fact that the first plea had not yet been handed in, though the case had lasted for months, and that, according to the lawyer, all the proceedings were still in their early stages, words which were obviously well calculated to lull the accused and keep him in a helpless state, in order suddenly to overwhelm him with the verdict, or at least with the announcement that the preliminary examination had been concluded in his disfavor and the case handed over to higher authorities. It was absolutely necessary for Kay to intervene personally. In states of intense exhaustion, such as he experienced this winter morning, when all these thoughts kept running at random through his head, he was particularly incapable of resisting this conviction. The contempt which he had once felt for the case no longer obtained. Had he stood alone in the world, he could easily have ridiculed the whole affair, though it was also certain that in that event it could never have arisen at all. But now his uncle had dragged him to this lawyer, family considerations had come in, his position was no longer quite independent of the course of the case. His position was no longer quite independent of the course the case took. He himself, with a certain inexplicable complacence, had imprudently mentioned it to some of his acquaintances. Others had come to learn of it in ways unknown to him. His relations with Fräulein Berschner seemed to fluctuate with the case itself. In short, he hardly had the choice now to accept the trial or reject it. He was in the middle of it and must fend for himself. To give in to fatigue would be dangerous. Yet there was no need for exaggerated anxiety at the moment. In a relatively short time, he had managed to work himself up to his present high position in the bank and to maintain himself in that position and win recognition from everybody. Surely if the abilities which had made this possible were to be applied to the unraveling of his own case, there was no doubt that it would go well. Above all, if he were to achieve anything, it was essential that he should banish from his mind once and for all the idea of possible guilt. There was no such guilt. This legal action was nothing more than a business deal such as he had often concluded to the advantage of the bank. A deal within which, as always happened, lurked various dangers which must simply be obviated. The right tactics were to avoid letting one's thoughts stray to one's own possible shortcomings and to cling as firmly as one could to the thought of one's advantage. From this standpoint, the conclusion was inevitable that the case must be withdrawn from Dr. Hold as soon as possible, preferably that very evening. According to him, that was something unheard of it was true, and very likely an insult, but Kay could not endure that his efforts in the case should be thwarted by moves possibly originating in the office of his own representative. Once the lawyer was shaken off, the petition must be sent in at once, and the officials be urged daily, if possible, to give their attention to it. This would never be achieved by sitting meekly in the attic lobby like the others with one's hat under the seat. Kay himself, or one of the women, or some other messenger must keep at the officials day after day and force them to sit down at their desks and study Kay's papers instead of gaping out into the lobby through the wooden rails. These tactics must be pursued unremittingly. Everything must be organized and supervised. The court would encounter for once an accused man who knew how to stick up for his rights. Yet even though Kay believed he could manage all this, the difficulty of drawing up the petition seemed overwhelming. At one time, not more than a week ago, he had regarded the possibility of having to draw up his own plea with merely a slight feeling of shame. It never even occurred to him that there might be difficulties in the way. He could remember that one of those mornings when he was up to his ears in work, he had suddenly pushed everything aside and seized his jotting pad with the idea of drafting the plan of such a plea and handing it to Dr. Hold by way of egging him on. But just at that moment, the door of the manager's room opened and the assistant manager came in laughing uproariously. That had been a very painful moment for Kay, though. Of course, the assistant manager had not been laughing at the plea, of which he knew nothing, but at a funny story from the stock exchange, which he had just heard, a story which needed illustrating for the proper appreciation of the point. So that the assistant manager, bending over the desk, took Kay's pencil from his hand and drew the required picture on the page of the jotting pad which had been intended for the plea. Today, Kay was no longer hampered by feelings of shame. The plea simply had to be drawn up. If he could find no time for it in his office, which seemed very probable, then he must draft it in his lodgings by night. And if his nights were not enough, then he must ask for furlough. Anything but stop halfway. That was the most senseless thing one could do in any affair, not only in business. No doubt it was a task that meant almost interminable labor. One did not need to have a timid and fearful nature to be easily persuaded that the completion of this plea was a sheer impossibility, not because of laziness or obstructive malice, which could only hinder Dr. Hold, but because to meet an unknown accusation, not to mention other possible charges arising out of it, the whole of one's life would have to be recalled to mind, down to the smallest actions and accidents, clearly formulated and examined from every angle. And besides, how dreary such a task would be. It would do well enough, perhaps, as an occupation for one's second childhood in years of retirement, when the long days needed filling up. But now when Kay should be devoting his mind entirely to work, when every hour was hurried and crowded, for he was still in full career and rapidly becoming a rival even to the assistant manager, when his evenings and nights were all too short for the pleasures of a bachelor life, this was the time when he must sit down to such a task. Once more his train of thought had led him into self-pity, almost involuntarily. Simply to make an end of it, he put his finger on the button which rang the bell in the waiting room. While he pressed it, he glanced at the clock. It was 11 o'clock. He had wasted 2 hours in dreaming, a long stretch of precious time, and he was, of course, still wearier than he had been before. Yet the time had not been quite lost. He had come to decisions which might prove valuable. The attendants brought in several letters and 2 cards from gentlemen who had been waiting for a considerable time. They were, in fact, extremely important clients of the bank who should on no account have been kept waiting at all. Why had they come at such an unsuitable hour? And why, they might well be asking in their turn behind the door, did the assiduous Kay allow his private affairs to usurp the best time of the day? Weary of what had gone before and wearily awaiting what was to come, Kay got up to receive the first of his clients. This was a jovial little man, a manufacturer whom Kay knew well. He regretted having disturbed Kay in the middle of important work, and Kay on his side regretted that he had kept the manufacturer waiting for so long, but his very regret he expressed in such a mechanical way, with such a lack of sincerity in his tone of voice, that the manufacturer could not have helped noticing it, had he not been so engrossed by the business in hand. As it was, he tucked papers covered with statistics out of every pocket, spread them before Kay, explained various entries, corrected a trifling error which his eye had caught even in his hasty survey, reminded Kay of a similar transaction which he had concluded with him a year before, mentioned casually that this time another bank was making great sacrifices to secure the deal, and finally sat in eager silence, waiting for Kay's comments. Kay had actually followed the man's argument quite closely in its early stages. The thought of such an important piece of business had its attractions for him too, but unfortunately not for long. He had soon ceased to listen and merely nodded now and then as the manufacturer's claims waxed in enthusiasm, until in the end he forgot to show even that much interest and confined himself to staring at the other's bald head bent over the papers and asking himself when the fellow would begin to realize that all his eloquence was being wasted. When the manufacturer stopped speaking, Kay actually thought for a moment that the pause was intended to give him the chance of confessing that he was not in a fit state to attend to business. And it was with regret that he perceived the intent look on the manufacturer's face. The alertness, as if prepared for every objection, which indicated that the interview would have to continue. So he bowed his head as at a word of command and began slowly to move his pencil point over the papers, pausing here and there to stare at some figure. The manufacturer suspected Kay of looking for flaws in the scheme, perhaps the decisive factors in the deal. The manufacturer suspected Kay of looking for flaws in the scheme. Perhaps the figures were merely tentative. Perhaps they were not the decisive factors in the deal. At any rate, he laid his hand over them and, shifting closer to Kay, began to expound the general policy behind the transaction. "It's difficult," said Kay, pursing his lips. And now that the papers, the only things he had to hold on to, were covered up, he sank weakly against the arm of his chair. He glanced up slightly, but only slightly, when the door of the manager's room opened, disclosed the assistant manager, a blurred figure who looked as if veiled in some kind of gauze. Kay did not seek for the cause of this apparition, but merely registered its immediate effect, which was very welcome to him. For the manufacturer at once bounded from his chair and rushed over to the assistant manager, though Kay could have wished him to be 10 times quicker, since he was afraid the apparition might vanish again. His fear was superfluous. The two gentlemen met each other, shook hands, and advanced together towards Kay's desk. The manufacturer lamented that his proposals were being cold-shouldered by the chief clerk, indicating Kay, who under the assistant manager's eye had once more bent over the papers. Then, as the two of them leaned against his desk and the manufacturer set himself to win the newcomer's approval for his scheme, it seemed to Kay as though two giants of enormous size were negotiating above his head about himself. Slowly lifting his eyes as far as he dared, he peered up to see what they were about, then picked one of the documents from the desk at random, laid it flat on his open palm, and gradually raised it, himself rising with it to their level. In doing so, he had no definite purpose, but merely acted with the feeling that this was how he would have to act when he had finished the great task of drawing up the plea which was to acquit him completely. The assistant manager, who was giving his full attention to the conversation, merely glanced at the paper without even reading what was on it, for anything that seemed important to the chief clerk was unimportant to him. Took it from Kay's hand, said, "Thanks, I know all that already," and quietly laid it back on the desk again. Kay darted a bitter look at him, but the assistant manager did not notice that, or if he did, was only amused. He laughed loudly several times, visibly disconcerted the manufacturer by a quick retort, only to counter it immediately himself, and finally invited the man into his private office where they could complete the transaction together. "It is a very important proposal," he said to the manufacturer. "I entirely agree. And the chief clerk," even in saying this, he went on addressing himself only to the manufacturer, "will, I am sure, be relieved if we take it off his shoulders. This business needs thinking over, and he seems to be overburdened today. Besides, there are some people who have been waiting for him in the anteroom for hours." Kay had still enough self-command to turn away from the assistant manager and address his friendly but somewhat fixed smile solely to the manufacturer. Except for this, he did not intervene, supporting himself with both hands on the desk, bending forward a little like an obsequious clerk, and looked on while the two men, still talking away, gathered up the papers and disappeared into the manager's room. In the very doorway, the manufacturer turned around to remark that he would not say goodbye yet, for of course he would report the result of the interview to the chief clerk. Besides, there was another little matter he had to mention. At last, Kay was alone. He had not the slightest intention of interviewing any more clients and vaguely realized how pleasant it was that the people waiting outside believed him to be still occupied with the manufacturer so that nobody, not even the attendant, could disturb him. He went over to the window, perched on the sill, holding on to the latch with one hand, and looked down on the square below. The snow was still falling. The sky had not yet cleared.